guys, it's Saturday and today we're going to take a look at a different way to handle promises in JavaScript. Specifically, we're going to take a look at async await. To get some housekeeping out of the way first, what does async mean? Asynchronous code is code that you don't want to run instantly because you want to wait for something to happen first. For example, if you had a function that made a request to an API, then you'd want to wait for the response to return before running the rest of that function, which might then use that response. So going on with that example, if you used an asynchronous request, JavaScript would branch off and run other code in the meantime while you're waiting for your response to come back. And then once your response does come back, JavaScript adds the rest of that function to the event queue and runs it once it's finished its current list of to-dos. Watch the event loop video linked in the description for more details. Now, examples of asynchronous code include any HTTP request to an API, waiting for a user to click a button, or setting a timer and waiting for it to run its course. Now, there are several different ways to write asynchronous code. You can use promises that we've covered, you can use a set timeout function to set a time limit before you want a certain block of code to run, or you can use async await. Async await is an alternative to promises, and it's the newer, fancier way to write asynchronous code. An async function lets you write asynchronous code but make it look like it's synchronous, the obvious benefit being the code becomes a lot easier to read and understand. Now, the big thing to note is that the async function is still using promises under the hood. They've just been covered up with an easy to read layer to look more attractive. A bit like me wearing this bodysuit to look like Thor. That thing's real, by the way. Link in the description while stocks last. To write an async function, you begin by adding the async keyword in front of your function. And from there, inside your function code, you add the await keyword to any line that you want to wait for before running the rest of your function. Now, here's an example of an asynchronous function. Let's look at it line by line. So in the first line, we're creating an async function called getUser. We're then making an API call to fetch my profile details from GitHub, and we're then turning this JSON response into a JavaScript object using the .json function. Now, both the fetch function and the .json function require the await keyword because we want to wait for those functions to finish doing their thing before we move on to the next line of code. Otherwise, the whole function would break. And lastly, inside the function, we're logging our newly created JavaScript object to the console. And finally, outside the function, we're calling our function to actually run the code we just wrote. Now, like I said earlier, as soon as JavaScript hits the await keyword, it's going to run off and do other things it needs to until the await is over. Again, watch the event loop video. Under the hood, the fetch function is just returning a promise, and the await keyword is telling JavaScript, wait for this promise to be resolved and then run the rest of this code. Now, speaking of promises, error handling inside a promise is simply done by catching rejected promises inside a catch block. Now, with async await, if you need to do error handling, you just use a try catch block, with your code being in a try block and adding an additional catch block to handle errors. Now, earlier I mentioned that async await is just promises wearing a six-pack bodysuit. Link in the description while stocks last. Now, this has several consequences. Firstly, an asynchronous function will always return a promise even if you don't have any asynchronous lines inside it. Who does that? Again, looking at another example, if our getUser function just returned an empty object and you tried to log that out, you would actually be logging out a promise. Like I said, even though this function isn't handling any asynchronous code, it's still returning a promise instead of a return value. And this means you can handle asynchronous code with the .then keyword in the same way you would a promise. So if you wanted to create an unholy Frankenstein's monster using both promises and async await, then you could technically do that. Who does that? Looking at this example, our getUser function call passes the return value of a fulfilled promise to another function which logs it out. Again, don't do this. Now, while async await is used instead of promises in most modern JavaScript code, since it's still using promises under the hood, it's still very useful to have a working knowledge of how promises work. And you'll definitely come across promises in any large JavaScript codebase because they still offer some benefits that async await doesn't, like using the promises.all syntax to combine promises. That's all for today. I hope that makes async await just a bit easier to understand.